gentlemen, inside the Borg and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain-drained media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth.
All right. We have a very special treat for you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Guest Michael Cremo, who is on the cutting edge of science and culture issues. In the course of a few months' time, he might be found on pilgrimages to sacred sites in India, appearing on a national television show, lecturing at a mainstream science conference, or speaking to an alternative science gathering. As he crosses disciplinary and cultural boundaries, he presents to the various audiences a compelling case for negotiating a new consciousness on the nature of reality. Michael Cremo is a member of the World Archaeological Congress and the European Association of Archeologists, as well as an associate member of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, specializing in history and philosophy of science. Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Great to be with you and all your listeners.
Thank you so much. I've had an opportunity to go through some of your books, and the information on there literally is mind-blowing. Talk about if we really did walk with the dinosaurs billions of years ago, and you have some very compelling evidence to point to that. It sure does shatter the paradigms of the way most people were raised and the way people are taught in society and the schools. So incredible stuff. I'm hoping we can get as much information as possible with the time we're having you here on the show. But before we get into some of the juicy topics, if you could definitely tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into alternative archaeology. What was it that gave you that aha moment and made you say, hey, this is what I'm going to get into with my life?
Well, I think the path I've taken has a lot to do with the way I grew up. My father was a military officer. He was an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force. And that meant a few things for me as I was growing up. And one thing it meant was I was moving to a lot of different places. Our family would move from place to place within the United States and to different countries around the world. So that opened my eyes to the understanding that there's more than one way to look at things. There's a lot of different perspectives that one can have. And another thing that I learned growing up among people in the diplomatic service and the intelligence services and the military is that there is such a thing as secret knowledge. There are things going on in the world that most people don't know about. There are facts that are hidden from view. So that had an influence on me as I was growing up. So I got exposed to a lot of different cultures as I was growing up. And among all the cultures that I came in contact with, one of them made a lot of sense to me, and that was the spiritual culture of ancient India, where there were a lot of different ideas that were quite different than what I learned from my teachers in high school and university. For example, when I started looking into the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, I could see there were accounts of a human presence on this planet going very far back in time, many millions of years, actually all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. And that was something that, as I said, was different from what I was learning in school, in high school or in university. There, my teachers were telling me that the first human beings like us came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. And before that, they said there weren't any humans like us, only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. So this idea that humans have been around for vast periods of time was something new. Of course, it's something that's found in a lot of the different ancient wisdom traditions, not just in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. But I began to wonder about that. Is there any truth to that, or is it simply mythology? And that's what got me looking into the whole history of archaeology. And, when I looked in the textbooks of archaeology, the current textbooks, I didn't find any evidence that humans like us have existed for these vast periods of time. But I decided, okay, let me look beyond the textbooks. That was something that I learned as I was growing up, that there are facts sometimes that are hidden away. So I started looking into the whole history of archaeology beyond what's in the textbooks today, going back into the old scientific reports in the scientific literature. And when I did that, I found many examples of scientists finding human bones, human footprints, human artifacts, many millions of years old. So I collected all of those reports into a book called Forbidden Archeology, which is probably the book that I'm best known for. And so that's, Rex, that's how I got into this whole topic of alternative archaeology, or as I call it, forbidden archaeology.
Fantastic. And when you say that these Sanskrit writings talk about how human origins go all the way back to the beginning, could you explain that to us a little bit? What were we in the beginning? Just light beings, or were we actually physically here at the source like we are now? Were we advanced? Were we using 100% of our mind versus the 10? What could you tell us about that?
Well, that's a great question, Rex, and that's a question a lot of people started asking me after they read my book, Forbidden Archaeology. They said to me, well, okay, you've got all this evidence that human beings have been around since the beginning, really. They didn't evolve from apes and monkeys, as we're taught now. Then where did we come from? And to answer that question that came from my readers, and I'm hearing it from you again today, to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And what I said there is, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? And today, most scientists will say that we're just machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival. As evolution scientist Richard Dawkins put it, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So it's a very materialistic picture of what a human being is. We're just machines made of matter, robot vehicles competing with each other for survival on this planet. And it's a very materialistic conception of who we are and what we are. As far as consciousness is concerned, such people would say, well, consciousness just comes from chemicals in the brain. And when, at the time of death, the chemicals in the brain become disorganized, there's no more consciousness. I take a different approach to this whole question of who we are. I say we are originally beings of pure consciousness. And this is an idea that's found in a lot of the different ancient wisdom traditions. It's certainly there in the Vedic teachings of ancient India. The idea that matter does not produce consciousness. Consciousness has its own independent existence apart from matter. Consciousness can come into contact with matter. It can become covered by matter. And as far as the question of where did we come from, I would say we are beings of pure consciousness. And that consciousness has no beginning, it has no end, it was never created, it will never be destroyed, it's always existing. And we were originally existing on a level of pure consciousness. However, now we've come into contact with matter, and when we come into contact with matter, we are given vehicles in which to function in the world of matter. Just like as human beings, we're normally meant to live on the land. If we want to live in a different element like water, we need some vehicle that will allow us to function under the water, like a submarine or a diving suit. So when a conscious self comes into contact with the material energy, it's given a vehicle made of the material energy in which to function on this level of reality. And there are different types of vehicles. There are plant vehicles, there are animal vehicles, there are human vehicles, and the full range of them is always available because each conscious self has its own level of awareness, and a particular type of vehicle will be more suitable for it than another. Just like we see people like to ride different kinds of vehicles, different types of automobiles, motorbikes, different types of vehicles. So that human vehicle was available, and the plant vehicles and animal vehicles were also available. So according to one's level of consciousness, one is placed in a certain type of vehicle. And the vehicle itself is temporary. So when the vehicle made of matter comes to an end, just like any body made of matter comes into existence at some point, and at a certain point it undergoes the experience we call death. But the conscious self does not die. It is never created, never destroyed. It just goes into another vehicle, and it keeps going into other vehicles until it's able to raise itself up beyond the level of material consciousness. Then it can exist without having to undergo the experience of the vehicle taking birth and death, coming into being and going out of existence.
Fantastic. And, you know, some of this stuff that you have as far as artifacts, if you could maybe tell our listeners the oldest artifacts that you've found.
Well, there's actually hundreds of these cases. I'll go over a few of the ones that I've always found very interesting. You know, during the California gold mine discoveries are something that's always fascinated me. During the 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners came from all over the world to get it, and they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains near the town of Sonora in Tuolumne County in California. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners were finding human artifacts. They were finding obsidian spear points, stone mortars and pestles, all kinds of stone tools and weapons, obviously made by some type of being that had human-like intelligence. Now, these things were found in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old. These discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. He wrote a massive book about these discoveries that was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. So this is really pretty astonishing, evidence for a human presence going back over 50 million years, but we don't see this mentioned in the textbooks today, although the discoveries were originally reported by a very prominent American scientist and published in a scientific publication that came out from Harvard University. These things are not mentioned in the textbooks today because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. If you've got a dominant theory in the scientific world, then scientists, when they encounter evidence that supports that theory, will let it pass through this filter, this intellectual filter, very easily. And you'll see these things mentioned in the textbooks. You'll hear scientists talking about them at scientific conferences. But if you've got evidence that radically contradicts a dominant idea, it tends to get filtered out. It tends to get set aside, forgotten, ignored. In some cases, it's actively suppressed. So around the same time that Dr. Whitney was reporting these discoveries, there was another American scientist, Dr. William Holmes from the Smithsonian Institution, who said if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of evolution, the dominant theory, then he wouldn't have published those reports because he should have known they can't possibly be true. It can't possibly be true that humans were existing that far in the past. The theory just doesn't allow it. So in that way, the discoveries were forgotten. And unless you're really aware of all the hidden evidence, you wouldn't even suspect that such things exist. Now, some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in a museum in California, and I've actually been in and I've seen them and photographed them. But, the average person would not even suspect they're there. They're not displayed to the public. They're kept in the museum storerooms. So that's one example. Now, if there were just one case like this, well, you could say, okay, there's a case or two, maybe questionable, but most of the evidence supports the dominant theories. But what's really amazing is that there are actually hundreds of these cases. So that's a case where you've got evidence for a human presence going back 50 million years. And you were asking about the oldest evidence. When you go further back in time, the evidence gets a little more sparse, and you could raise more questions about it. But actually, the oldest piece of evidence that I encountered in the 8 years of research that I did into the whole history of archaeology were some round metallic objects that were found in mines in South Africa near a place called Ottosdal in the western Transvaal region. I call them metallic because they're made of hematite, which is a naturally occurring type of iron ore. Hematite is actually considered to be a kind of semi-precious stone. It's a mineral. So these round objects are about 1 or 2 inches in diameter, and they have, going around their centers, parallel grooves around their equators. Some of them have 2, some 3, some 4. So they're very interesting objects. They were given to an independent company of metallurgists to examine, and they said they couldn't tell how they could have formed naturally in the earth. So that means they had to have been made by someone with human-like intelligence. And these things are found in layers of rock about 2 billion, not million, but 2 billion years old in South Africa. So there are many interesting cases like that. That's one of the more extreme cases.
Do they have any idea what they might have been used for?
Well, people have written to me with different ideas about what they may have been used for. Some have suggested maybe they were a type of weapon, like a cannonball or something, or a musket ball or something like that. That's one idea that's been proposed. Some people have written to me speculating that wondering if they were radioactive, and maybe they were some kind of means for storing radioactive waste or something like that. Some people have made other proposals. When I look at them, I kind of have a sensation maybe there was some kind of game piece used in some sort of game. But there are a lot of speculative ideas about what they may have been used for among the people who consider that they were made by some sort of intelligent being.
Quick, I've seen those before, Michael, and they certainly are an anomaly because, as you're right, they're circular and they've got those weird grooves parallel. The game piece does sound like an interesting theory. That could very well be. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but didn't they also circulate in a certain way, or they had another anomaly that made it very likely that they were artificially created?
Well, in the original reports, which came out from a tabloid newspaper, it was stated that they would rotate in the museum case in which they were displayed at the Museum of Natural History in Klerksdorp, South Africa. So there were reports like that. Of course, this is not a report from a scientific journal. It's a report from a tabloid newspaper, which some people question. Of course, I don't think that everything mentioned in a tabloid newspaper is necessarily correct, but it's not necessarily wrong either.
Right.
So, it's interesting. I put a picture of one of these objects in my book, Forbidden Archeology. And when the book came out, a television producer in Europe got in touch with me and and wanted to know where exactly the object was, and because he wanted to go down to South Africa and film it. So I put him in touch with the director of the museum, who informed us that that object had been stolen from the museum by a person he called a, quote, white witch. So that's another whole aspect of things. I hope it's being put to good use by whoever took it. But that adds another dimension to it, beyond the purely physical.
Right. Now, also, when you get into some of the different types of skeletal remains and bones that were found, I've read reports from 12-foot Cyclops-type beings to just other large skeletal remains of, a giant person or giant people, basically. What information do you have on that you could share with us?
Well, I definitely believe that large-size humans existed in the past. There's a lot of information about that in a lot of different ancient wisdom traditions. It's there in the Bible, which talks about the giant Goliath and about how in ancient days giants lived in the earth. And it's there in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which say that in previous ages, living things were bigger than they are today. So that's a general principle that I accept, that in the past, living things, including human beings, were larger than they are today. I live in California. In the Sierra Nevada mountains, you've got the California redwood trees, which some of them are over 5,000 years old, and they're the biggest things on Earth. They're hundreds of feet tall, over 300 feet tall, and they're huge. They're actually the biggest living things on Earth. And I think they're holdovers from a previous age when not only the plants, but other kinds of living things were much bigger than they are today. It's recognized by paleontologists that before 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, a lot of the animals were bigger than they are today. So I think humans also may have been bigger than they are today. Now, the question is the evidence for this. There's a lot of photographs that circulate on the web that are unfortunately Photoshop hoaxes, or if you try to track down the actual specimens, the large-size human bones, you can't do it really. So we have to be careful about evidence like that. There was one famous picture that's been circulating on the web for years. Correspondents have sent it to me many, many different times. It shows a huge skeleton lying in the ground with some little human figures, archaeologists around it with shovels and picks and things like that. So, I studied this picture, and from, there was the skull of this thing, which was huge, and behind the skull was standing one of these little archaeologist figures. And I could tell from the shadows on the skeleton that the light source, the sun, was high and to the rear. So the person standing behind the skull should have been casting a shadow over the top of the skull, but he wasn't. And that kind of clued me into it. Well, this is a Photoshop collage. And it was later admitted, that this photo, which circulates very widely on the web, was indeed made by somebody for a contest, like a Photoshop kind of contest. So that is one problem with this sort of thing, that a lot of the evidence that we see circulating around may be either not real or very difficult to verify. The most credible report that I've seen for large-sized human bones comes from a report that came out of France late in the 19th century. It was published in the scientific literature. There was a French anthropologist named Georges Lapouge, and he found some large-sized human bones at a place called Castelnau in France, in central France. And it wasn't a complete skeleton, but there were pieces of human bone, a thigh bone, a femur, and an upper arm bone. It's called a humerus. And physical anthropologists, if they have, say, a thigh bone, they can measure it and they can tell you how big the human being would have been that had that kind of a thigh bone of that size. And they determined that the creature that had, the human being that had that thigh bone had to have been about 11 feet tall, which is really pretty huge. I mean, sometimes you see reports of discoveries of skeletons of people 7 feet tall, but there are people 7 feet tall today. You know, they're on the NBA basketball teams. There are even one or two people today 8 feet tall, but say there's nobody 10 or 11 feet tall. So there was a scientific publication about this discovery with photographs and measurements, and that's the most credible evidence for large-size human bones that I've encountered recently. And you know, like I said, there are many other reports. There are hundreds of other reports of large-size human bones having been found. When I was in Russia once, somebody told me that in a mosque in Samarkand, they have a tomb of an old saint who was 24 feet tall or something like that. But these things are very difficult to verify, you know, to actually go to the place, which I like to do, to actually find those large-size human bones and personally verify them. So I do think large-size humans did exist, but verifying the accounts that are circulating today is a little bit difficult.
And with that being said, a lot of people, especially those that follow the Judeo-Christian or the Abrahamic religions, believe that there were angels that interbred with humans, and then some of the scientific communities, or I guess you could call them conspiracy theorists in some sense, and other people as well would say that those might have been extraterrestrials or a different species from a different planet that came and did that, and that's what caused these giants to be created, or that's what made them. Do you think that that's a possibility, or do you feel that they were made here on Earth and our ancestors millions of years ago were just larger?
Yeah, well, I'm willing to consider all possibilities. As far as I'm concerned, there is extraterrestrial life, and in one sense, I'd say we're all extraterrestrials. As conscious beings, we don't originate from this level of reality or this planet. So in one sense, we're all extraterrestrials, and I do believe that conscious intelligent life, is present throughout the universe. So I think it's entirely possible that in ages past we were visited by extraterrestrial beings who may have interbred with humans on this planet. And I think that's a definite possibility. There are examples of this in different ancient wisdom traditions. And the idea of celestial terrestrial hybrid beings. This concept is found, as you said, in some of the religious traditions and the different cultural traditions that are still with us on this planet today. So I think that is a possibility, but I think it may also have been possible that there were purely terrestrial beings who were of large size also. So I don't think one thing rules out the other. I think both things are possible.
There are also reports of these artifacts that were found in coal deposits. It was like a brick wall that was about 100 million years old. That was the best way they described it, but the bricks were almost mirror-like and extremely smooth. Do you have information on that? I think it was found somewhere in Oklahoma or something.
Yeah, that was a case from early in the 20th century from Heavener, spelled like heaven, but I think it's pronounced Heavener, Oklahoma. Maybe I've got the pronunciation wrong. Forgive me if anybody's from there. But once I pronounced it Heavener, and somebody told me it's Heavener, Oklahoma. So there was a man there who was working in a coal mine about 2 miles underneath the ground, and they were blasting out what they call rooms in the coal using dynamite. In other words, they would set off a charge, and it would open up some space, and they would clear out the coal, and then they'd set another charge, and then clear out the coal. So when they were clearing the coal out of one of these rooms, this miner and his co-workers noticed at the end of the room a wall, and it was made of 6-inch square blocks of stone. And the man said in an affidavit that he signed that the stone was polished to like a mirror-like surface, and the coal in these mines dates back to the Carboniferous period, which is over 300 million years old. So it was really pretty amazing. He said when they informed the mine managers of this, they were taken out of the mine was closed, and they were sent to another mine to work. It really is interesting. There are other interesting discoveries from coal mines. In the year 1862, there was a scientific journal called The Geologist, and it published an interesting report of a human skeleton that had been found 90 feet deep in coal deposits in Macoupin County in the state of Illinois, which is near St. Louis. And according to the report, above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that was unbroken. And that's an important detail because sometimes people try to explain these discoveries away by saying, okay, maybe a few hundred years ago or a few thousand years ago, there was a human skeleton near the surface, and it kind of slipped down through an ancient fissure down into some very ancient coal deposits, and or they might say, well, there was a burial, somebody buried a body. But people normally don't bury bodies 90 feet deep in the ground, and even if they had dug a grave, or if there had been a fissure, that possibility is ruled out because the report said the layer of slate rock above the skeleton was unbroken. That means no fissure, no burial. And according to geologists in the state of Illinois, the age of the coal at that location, at that depth, is again about 300 million years. And then there was another report, also again from the state of Illinois, from Morrisonville, Illinois, in the year 1892, told of a woman named Mrs. Robert Culp, who was putting pieces of coal into a coal-burning stove, and one of the pieces was very big, too big to put in the stove, so she broke it in half. And when she broke it in half, there was inside the coal a gold chain about 10 inches long. And she picked up the gold chain, at the middle, and both of the pieces of coal were hanging off on, still attached to the ends of the chain. So from that report, which was published in the Morrisonville Times, which is a newspaper in that city, from that report, we were able to tell what mine the coal came from. And it turned out, again, that the coal was about 300 million years old. And then there was another case that recently came to my attention. It's from the state of West Virginia. There was a man named Newton R. Anderson. When he was 10 years old in 1944, he was a little boy, but one of his household chores was to put coal into the coal furnace in the basement of his family's house, because they were using coal to heat the house and the water and stuff like that. So it's the same sort of story. He was putting coal in, and one big piece of coal fell off from his coal shovel onto the floor and broke in half, and he found a metal bell, a handbell, in this piece of coal, and this bell was about 7 inches tall, and it looked like the kind of bell that was used in ancient temple worship in India, of all places. So it was, again, studies were done of the coal, and it turned out that it was, again, over 300 million years old. So that is really kind of astonishing, because 300 million years ago is from before the time of the dinosaurs even. So you're right. There have been a lot of discoveries, interesting discoveries of human artifacts and even human skeletons being found in coal deposits many hundreds of millions of years old. Now, a lot of these discoveries come from the 19th century or the early 20th century, and I think there's a reason for that, because in more modern times, in the middle to latter part of the 20th century and today, a lot of the coal mining is done with huge machines. It's automated, and it crushes up the coal, and it just gets taken out of the mine, all crushed up. And it's not. But back in the 19th century and early 20th century, a lot of the coal mining was more hands-on. There was hands-on mining going on. So maybe because of that, there were more discoveries of such things. And there may be a lot more of this evidence out there, if we could get reports from coal miners in different parts of the world that are still doing the mining more hands-on. So, but it is a whole fascinating category of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity, these discoveries from coal mines and from coal deposits.
When you say you found these anomalies like the gold chain in this coal deposit, did they find any specific symbols or something that would connect it to something else that was found in the coal deposit, estimated to be about the same era?
Well, I did mention this bell that was found in West Virginia in coal that was, as I said, it was a handbell. And on the top of the handle was a figure that was a kneeling human figure with wings, you could say, outspread, almost like an angel's wings, but the head had a bird-like head. The body was human. There were wings, but the head was bird-like. And in India, there was a creature, a divine being called Garuda, who looked something like that. And temple bells that are used in temple worship in India, even to this day, have that Garuda figure on the handle of the handbells that they use in their temple worship. So that was kind of interesting. You were asking if there were any kind of symbol or mark that would connect these objects with, say, a particular culture. That's something that comes to mind. I was immediately, because I've seen these bells, handbells that are used in temple worship in India, and this bell from the coal in West Virginia looks exactly like that. So, of course, that gets you into a whole topic, and that is, it's another area of what we could call forbidden archaeology. It's not my specific focus of research, but it's the presence of old world cultures in the New World, North and South America, before the time of Columbus. Mostly, people have the idea, scientists have the idea that the first European to visit the New World was Christopher Columbus, and maybe a few Vikings, before that, but beyond that, they don't think there was a lot of contact between the old world and the new world. But there is evidence suggesting that in ancient times there was communication between the Americas and Asia and Africa and Europe and the ancient cultures like the Egyptians and the Sumerians and cultures of India, Southeast Asia, and the New World. So that's another whole area. It's not my specific area of focus, but it is a topic in forbidden archaeology.
And some of the artifacts also that you discuss in your lectures and in your book, are they complex at all, or are they more like just hand tools that the Native Americans you would find used commonly?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting topic. Most of the evidence that I talk about is of the nature of stone tools and things like that. Now, I do think that in the past, people may have had what we call high-tech sort of things, but that sort of thing does not last very long in terms of geological time. There have been studies done that demonstrate this. One reason why this topic comes up is ecological studies. Ecologists have pointed out that our worldwide urban technological civilization has caused a lot of damage to the environment. And sometimes they wonder, well, how long would it take the Earth to recover its natural state? Say if human beings disappeared today, how long would it take the Earth to recover? So there have been scientific studies done, and documentaries have come out on the National Geographic Channel and Discovery Channel, like World Without Us, where they examine, well, what would happen to our huge cities and all of our technology if humans ceased to exist today? How long would it take the Earth to recover? And they found that they estimate that within 10 or 20,000 years, most of our stuff would be gone. I mean, we think it's rather permanent. We have our cars, our metal stuff. It seems very solid, but it oxidizes. Anything made of iron or steel eventually is going to oxidize. In other words, it's going to rust away. It isn't going to last forever. Most metals will oxidize. Plastics will dissolve ultimately over the course of many thousands of years. Our cities, if there weren't fire departments to prevent fires and things like that, fires would burn through the cities again and again, destroy a lot of stuff. If we weren't keeping up our dams and our seawalls and river embankments and things like that, most of our major cities are on large bodies of water. There are tidal waves, there are floods, when all this stuff happens, it destroys a lot of stuff. So it may have been that millions of years ago, I was talking about, say, the California gold mines, where you've got stone tools and weapons in deposits going back about 50 million years. So it may have been that there were people in that time who had an advanced civilization. Maybe they had smartphones and laptop computers and things like that. And there may have also been some people using stone tools and weapons. That's actually true today. Even though we live in a high-tech world, there are still people in this world, tribal people in various isolated parts of the world, who are using stone tools and weapons. They're still in the Stone Age as far as we're concerned. So it may have been like that millions of years ago also. But in terms of what's going to survive to the present day for archaeologists to find, the stone tools are going to survive. Stone is not going to go away. But if there were computers, well, the metals would oxidize, the plastics would dissolve. You're not going to see very much left after 50 million years of that high-tech kind of stuff. So But we have to keep in mind that there are two ways to know about the past. One way is by what we can physically find in the layers of the earth. That may not tell us the complete story because some stuff doesn't preserve. But there's another way to know about the past, and that's the records left by different cultures and wisdom traditions and things like that. So, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India described that millions of years ago, there were huge cities on this planet. There were people with advanced technologies. They had flying craft. They were called vimanas, or spaceships. I talked about this on some episodes of the series Ancient Aliens that aired on the History Channel. And, they had weapons resembling modern nuclear weapons. So there's another way to know about the past, and that's from the knowledge that has come down through the ages about what was happening in those ancient times. So I think people in the past did have advanced technologies and advanced scientific knowledge, but the physical remains may not have always survived because that kind of thing doesn't last very long in terms of the geological forces that operate.
And with some of the stuff that people actually could go out and see now that you would say is much older than even the pyramids in Giza that might be approximately 12,500 years old, because it looks like there's possible water erosion around the pyramids of Giza, which might make them even older. Do you think that they're older than that? Or and also, what other things could people go look at?
Well, the kinds of things that I've been talking about in my books about archaeology are artifacts, stone tools, weapons, human bones, things like that. Those can be millions of years old. For example, I've been into the museum where the artifacts from the California gold mines come from, and those are about 50 million years old. They're human artifacts. So I think there are things in the museums that are actually millions of years old. They may not seem very significant. They may be stone tools, stone weapons, and things like that, but they were made by human beings. They are evidence for a human presence, and they are millions of years old. But there are other things as well, but they may be a little difficult for many people to comprehend, or they may be scientifically difficult to date. For example, all over India, there are temples that commemorate events that go back many millions of years. And these temples apparently have been built and rebuilt many different times over vast periods of ages. And they contain sacred images and things like that that could be many millions of years old. For example, there's one temple in South India called the Sri Rangam Temple. And it's a huge temple complex. The current buildings are maybe about 1,000 or 2,000 years old, but apparently there have been temples at this site for vast periods of time that have been built and rebuilt again and again over the course of actually millions of years old. But one of the sacred images that's worshipped in this temple is called Ranganath. If you look at the temple history, it's very interesting. This object, which is a form in stone of the Vedic god Vishnu, is said to be of extraterrestrial origin, that it came to Earth from some higher level of reality millions of years ago, and has been worshipped on Earth for many, many millions of years. So that is something that I've seen. I've been to this temple. I've seen this deity of Vishnu that is, according to the temple histories, many millions of years old. It's been continuously revered and worshipped for millions of years. So there are things like that on this planet even today, that can be seen that are very interesting, either in terms of their extraterrestrial origin or their antiquity, how old they are. Another time I was in a temple in Bali, which is in Indonesia, and this was the Temple of the Moon in Bali, and within the temple complex, they had, within the temple complex, there are different temple structures, and on top of one of the temple structures was this huge brass drum, a double-sided brass drum, huge, absolutely huge. And they say it's of extraterrestrial origin, that it came from the moon god, according to them. So there are some interesting things that can be seen on this planet. Of course, you were mentioning the Sphinx and the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. I mean, normally they think they're about 6,000 years old or 5,000 years old. But as you were pointing out, Dr. Robert Schoch, who was a geologist from Boston University in the United States, he did a geological study of the enclosure around the Sphinx, which has channels that appear to be worn into the rock by water erosion channels. And the last time there was any significant rainfall in the Sahara Desert, which is where the pyramids and the Sphinx are, was about 11,000 or 12,000 years ago. So you were mentioning that. But there may
That's just a drop in the bucket, though, compared to what you're discussing here with, obviously, something 50 million years old.
Yeah, alternative history and alternative archaeology is like a big topic. And there are lots of different researchers working in this topic, and they've got their areas of specialization. A lot of them are working on the more recent end of the spectrum, trying to show that the age of the classical civilizations goes back further in time than most historians and archaeologists are now prepared to accept. So they're kind of pushing things back a few thousand years, that there may be civilizations that people think are 5,000 or 6,000 years old, but really they're 10,000 or 20,000 years old or something like that. So that's one area of alternative archaeology. I'm kind of at the deep end of the spectrum, looking at how old is our human species really. And as I said, most archaeologists are going to say humans like us are less than 200,000 years old in terms of our presence on this planet, whereas I'm showing there's evidence that humans like us have been present for vastly longer periods of time, many millions of years, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years. And what that really means is, well, we need new explanations for human origins. What we're being told in the textbooks today isn't correct.
Well, history is obviously continually rewriting itself in the schools and universities, and when you talk about human devolution, I haven't had an opportunity to read your entire book, but when I think of devolution, I certainly do see many people today in society devolving if you look at the classical sense of evolution and devolution. Technology is fantastic. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people rely on it too much and tend to forget how to think more than just a couple sentences or one or two steps ahead. So when you talk about people that might have been around 50 million years ago, even longer, further than that, before the dinosaurs, yet there's approximately 7 billion people here now. Have you noticed with the work and the research that you've done, has there been a continual type of reset button that kind of matches and correlates a specific pattern of events that happen that cause balanced and harmony back within nature. If it gets out of line, it's going to balance itself out per se.
Well, I think there are periodic catastrophes that do take place, which means there is a reset button, you could say. According to the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, time is basically cyclical. And just the average person is aware of certain cycles of time. There's the day-night cycle that we're all familiar with. During the day, we tend to be awake, most people, and at night, go to sleep, dream, things like that. And then in the day, get up again. So most of us are familiar with the day-night cycle. Of course, people who work night shifts, they have to adjust. We tend to be aware of the seasonal cycle. In the temperate parts of the world, there's a cycle of seasons. There's winter, there's spring, there's summer, there's fall. We do different things. We dress differently during the different seasons. So we're used to that. But ancient people were aware of even vaster cycles of time, ages. And in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, there's some descriptions of these cycles. You can also find them in the Mayan calendar, which talks about huge cycles of time. The Roman and Greek calendars talked of different ages, golden ages, silver ages, iron ages. So this idea of cyclical time is something.
Do you think they meant that literally, Michael?
Yes, I do. And even modern science has recognized periodicities, that certain things tend to happen in cycles. But when I look at these ancient Indian cycles, they talk about cycles of creation and destruction. So the current creation cycle began about 2 billion years ago, they say, and it's divided into 14 subsections called manvantars. And we're now in the 7th manvantar of the current creation cycle, which began about 2 billion years ago, according to these ancient Indian calendars. So each manvantar ends with a devastation, after which the earth has to be repopulated. So if we're in the 7th manvantar now, that means over the past 2 billion years or so, there have been 6 major devastations that have taken place. So that's what the ancient Sanskrit writings say. Now, when we look at modern paleontology, we learn life began on Earth about 2 billion years ago, and since then, according to modern science, there have been 6 major extinction events spaced at intervals of several hundred million years. The last major extinction event being the one that wiped out the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. So whether we look in the ancient wisdom traditions or we look at what modern science tells us, we see there are periodic catastrophes that wipe out most of the life on Earth. Actually, according to the ancient Sanskrit writings, life on Earth is completely wiped out. But, there's higher levels of the cosmos. It's, like people today are familiar with what they call cloud computing, which means you can store your files and your images and your programs on the cloud, so to speak, so that if your device gets destroyed, well, you get another device and you can download all your programs and files and pictures and music and stuff like that. So apparently, cosmologically, there's something like that as well, so that when devastations take place on this level of reality, which they do from time to time, there are periodic catastrophes that devastate this level of reality. There is information on higher levels of reality which can be used to restore life on this level of reality. And that happens periodically. So you're kind of asking, earlier, do I think there is a reset button that things kind of go down for a while and then there's a reset and it starts up again from some better position? Yes, I do think that happens and has happened repeatedly in the history of life on Earth. And this was something the ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle understood. They said, civilizations have risen and fallen many times in the long history of life on Earth. So yeah, I do think there is a reset button that goes on that is used from time to time. There's scientific evidence for that, and there is evidence from different ancient wisdom traditions for that.
Well, let's jump back a moment when you said that, correct me if I'm wrong here, that the Sanskrit writings say life is basically destroyed. It's all destroyed. A lot of science right now is doing its best to pinpoint if this reality that we're in is almost a simulation type, almost holographic reality. Doesn't mean it's not real, but that's the essence of it. And you talk about catastrophes that happen, yet they're being recorded at higher levels of consciousness. So do you feel that we are like literally, I'm sure you've seen the movie The Matrix, do you feel that
Yes,
we might be that type of paradigm? I mean, that would be a good analogy, obviously not Mr. Smith and stuff like that as much, but just a good overall possibility?
Yes, I do, because I believe in a consciousness-based universe, not simply a materialistic universe. A lot of modern astrophysics and astronomy is based on the idea that, well, there's just matter floating around in space, organized into different balls, like we're on a ball of stone called the Earth, that's floating around in the void, and there's a ball of stone called the moon that's circling around us, and then, you go on and on. There's a ball of burning gas called, the sun that's out there. It's a very materialistic way of looking at things, whereas I tend to look at it more rather than a matter-based, a consciousness-based picture of reality, where the concept of a virtual reality system makes a lot of sense. As I was saying in the beginning when we were talking about my book, Human Devolution, originally I think we're beings of pure consciousness. We have the ability to use our pure consciousness to perceive things, to act, but if we become egotistical or selfish, we can't exist on that level of reality anymore. The ruling principle of that higher level of reality is loving harmony. And if we become selfish or egotistical, we get put into an artificial reality system where we can act out our selfish desires using vehicles that are made for us. So it's almost like we've been put into a virtual computer game. There are, computer games where you take on an identity, an avatar that becomes you in the game. You take on a certain character. So although in your real life you may be so-and-so, and you have your friends and your reality that you normally exist in, when you enter the game, you become another personality. It's the same with the other personalities in the game. They may have their own independent existence apart from the game, but when they enter into the game, they take on a certain identity that is provided by the game in that virtual reality. And then you've got a whole thing that goes on between the different players in the game. So I think the idea that we're in some kind of virtual reality system and we've forgotten our identity apart from that system is a really good metaphor for what we are. So the universe would have that we experience now would have more in common, I believe, with a computer-generated virtual reality system than with the kind of purely mechanistic, materialistic explanation that most scientists now give for the universe, where they try to explain things without reference to consciousness, intelligence, and design.
Well, and also, when you talk about this possibility of a virtual reality type matrix that we are in, to live out certain desires through specific vessels, then you get into the natural versus artificial, and if we're at the very top level of consciousness, the further down the rabbit hole we go, it becomes more materialistic. Nowadays, you have many people that have a lot of money and are extremely intelligent and very prestigious positions. For example, Ray Kurzweil, that really is pushing for this, singularity technology advancements where transhuman movement, live forever in this physical body or have a metallic body and have your consciousness continually uploading. Literally that type of science fiction stuff. It makes me think that maybe that is more devolution, even though it sounds great technologically, like you could tap into any computer satellite in space and go all over the physical, aka virtual universe, but you're really untapping and going further away from the ultimate source of consciousness, which many people might call God. So with that said, in the texts that you have had an opportunity to study and research, these Sanskrit texts, does it talk about a artificial and a natural type essence that compete against each other since the beginning or at all times to kind of balance things out in some way?
Well, the natural condition for consciousness is on the level of pure consciousness. There's Sanskrit words for these things. There's a mantra, aham brahmasmi. That means I am pure consciousness. I am a spirit soul. And were originally meant to exist on that level. But on that level, one exists in loving harmony with all other conscious beings and with the source of all conscious beings. I mean, you can use the word God for that. But and for conscious being, you could use the word soul if you want. But I find using that terminology, and for some people, their minds sort of turn off when you say that. If you say to them soul, they think, well, I can't really consider that. That's just a religious belief. It's just
right.
a belief. But if I say conscious self, I mean, who can deny that you're conscious in a self?
Exactly.
It doesn't require any belief. It's just the most real experience that we have. It's the foundation of everything.
Science can back it up. Even science can back up that plants have some type of consciousness with experiments that they've done. So, yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, you could take that to put it in religious terminology. Every living thing has a soul, which I believe. But I tend to speak in terms of consciousness. And then if you think, okay, I'm an individual, personal, conscious being, then what is my source? I mean, everything's got to have a source, really. So it's logical, it's rational to think that just as I am conscious, individual, and personal, there must be some source of all conscious beings that is also individual, personal, and conscious. And we're meant to exist in harmony with each other and with that source of all conscious beings. It's something that a person who isn't inclined towards religious terminology, I think, can wrap their mind around a little bit easier. So I think, yes, there is a God in the sense of there being a source of all conscious beings that is individual, personal, and conscious. And we are meant to exist along with all other individual, conscious, personal beings on that higher level of reality in harmony with each other. Now, if we become egotistical or selfish, which means we want to not exist in loving harmony with others, but we want to dominate, control, and exploit, we need somewhere else to do that. because that level of pure consciousness is a place where that sort of thing doesn't go on. So there's this material level of reality, which is the field for that kind of action. And our original form of pure consciousness can't engage in selfish, exploitative, greedy activities. So we have to be given a vehicle that we identify with that will function in that way. So that's this artificial reality world that we live in, where we're given vehicles that we can use for, well, they have actually a dual purpose. You could actually use the vehicle to go back to the level of pure consciousness, in other words, get out of the artificial reality system and back to the real reality system, or you can get more and more deeply involved in the game of domination, control, and exploitation and competition with others. So there are two types of conscious beings in this world. One type is trying to go back to the original reality, and the other type is trying to go more and more deeply into the world of dominating, controlling, and exploiting matter and other material beings. So, according to the number of such persons, that'll be the kind of reality that we experience here. It could be possible to have a whole worldwide human civilization organized in such a way that we try to satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible without dividing ourselves into different competing, struggling groups and working cooperatively to raise consciousness back to its original pure state. But that isn't the situation that we're in right now. We're in the situation where we're at a time where there are increasing numbers of people who want to get more and more deeply involved into the competition, exploitation, domination, controlling mentality, and for that purpose, they want to convince us, well, we're just purely material beings, we're machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival, and that's why that idea is being taught in practically every school system and every education system all around the world, because there are forces that want to see us remain entangled in this world of producing and consuming more and more material things and competing groups, because that generates wealth and power that those who are in charge of this system can use and exploit, and so it's that's one meaning of the term devolution, that getting more and more deeply involved and trying to dominate, control, and exploit matter to ignore our real nature and to avoid trying to restore our consciousness to its original pure state.
With that said, there's a lot of information out there now that leads to specific events happening for certain reasons that are literally at a grand scale, worldwide sometimes, statewide, countrywide, and they benefit certain individuals that, if you look down at their family lines, they've been in very prestigious positions of power for thousands of years. And then you talk about this game and people in power. Do you have information or knowledge with what you've seen in the artifacts, etc., that lead to specific places or people running this game?
Well, yeah, I'm going to just speak in general terms that there have always, according to the ancient Sanskrit writings, there have always been two categories of persons in the world, conscious beings in the world, the suras and the asuras. So the suras are those who believe that ultimately we're beings of pure consciousness. There's a higher intelligence in the universe that is ultimately the force of good, and we're meant to align ourselves with that. And then there's the other group who's the opposite, that is more based not on trying to develop the resource of consciousness, but in trying to dominate, control, and exploit the resources of matter, and to try to entangle people in that, producing and consuming more and more material things and benefiting from it. So that's the two types have always existed and always will, and it's just up to each individual to decide which path they're going to follow. And it may be difficult at certain times. You could say the forces who are more on the side of developing consciousness are dominant in the world, and they're able to organize society and civilizations so as to further those goals. We're not in one of those times at the present moment. We're in a time when those who are more into dominating, controlling, and exploiting matter and engaging everybody in that, they're in the more dominant position now. So I'm not primarily a political theorist so I know there are those who get deeply into trying to trace out all the details, the who's and the whys of all of that. I've got my little area that I'm working in, but but just the basic principle that there are these two types of conscious beings, I think, is really, to me, explains a lot of what I see around me.
Let's get back into maybe some artifacts or information. The internet's like a bathroom wall. You can write anything, be anyone at any time. You can be 6.5 feet tall, have 7th degree black belt, and speak 24 different languages. But there's also some very good information on the internet. You can find some very credible stuff, white papers and knowledge that you're not going to get in the brain drain media a lot of the times. It's neat to see the History Channel and other cable channels give out a lot of good information now. There's definitely a lot of stuff out there now that you wouldn't have seen 5-10 years ago even. So I do feel a lot of people are waking it up, and it's definitely good for your work. Please check out Michael's work, mcremo.com. That's mcremo.com. Also, you've got some great reviews. I've been to Amazon.com, looked at a lot of the reviews you've got on there. I do that with all the people that I have an opportunity to speak with. And most of the reviews are really good. Even the reviews that aren't 5 stars, the funny thing is you read those and the people just say it's too much information for them. So I would take that as a compliment, Michael. You can't please everyone all the time anyway. So denial is a very powerful thing, and I really appreciate the information you're bringing out there for us. Now, Michael, with the book that you wrote, Human Devolution, I talk to people about this all the time. It does seem that the society that we live in right now, I'm going to use another movie paradigm or a movie connection here. If you've seen the movie Idiocracy, where people in the future literally have IQs of like 50. If they're up to 75 IQ, they're considered a prodigy, a genius, touched by God. Do you think that this path that we're on right now, it's going to continue to go that way, where people are just going to become more and more detached and ridiculously stupid?
Unfortunately, yes. According to the ancient Sanskrit writings, time goes in cycles. Just like in a year, we go through spring, summer, fall, winter. There's a cycle of ages called yugas. And it starts out with a golden age called Satya Yuga, when most of the conscious beings on Earth are very highly evolved in terms of their intelligence and their spiritual awareness. And then with each successive age, things get progressively worse. And we're now in the 4th age, which is called the age of Kali. And there are predictions in the ancient Sanskrit writing about what this age will be like. It's described, it will be an age of increasing social and environmental disturbance. It's described that the weather patterns will become extremely disturbed. There will be extremes of heat, extremes of cold, which is something we're seeing now in the world. It'll say that the governments will become extremely exploitative, and people will just want to run away to the forest and to live on their own away from government. It says that people will gradually decrease in intelligence, as you were saying. So, unfortunately, I think that is going to be the pattern. However, just because it's going to rain, it doesn't mean you have to get wet. You can try to shelter yourself, shelter those who you care about. And even though the trend of the age may be down, you can still try to preserve yourself and save yourself and others who you care about. So, yes, as the age of Kali goes on, things are, in fact, going to get progressively worse.
You know, and with that said, do you think that this time that we're in right now, within the next possibly couple years even, we could see people heading out for the hills because of a possible dollar collapse or Ebola outbreak? Or do you think that's more stuff to just keep people wound up in the media, kind of that carrot at the end of the stick?
Well, some actually have already.
Right.
Gone.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you've obviously got
to set up
small
intentional
factions.
communities and to try to, either individually or in groups, do that. I think there is, according to the text that I follow, for the next 9,000 or 10,000 years, there's going to be an opportunity to escape the effects of the age of Kali. Although it's an age where the trend is down, for right now we're in an era where, despite all of the downward trends, there's an opportunity for people to come to higher levels of awareness. And as you said, you notice yourself in the media and on the web, there are areas where knowledge is being communicated, people are getting together, and so, yeah, there are things, that opportunity is there.
Now, when you look at possibilities of the moon, what it is, how long it's been there, there's a lot of theories out there on that, and I don't want to get into the possible theories of if it's artificial or not, but I did do some research on Plato, and supposedly he was telling a lot of people that listen to him back when he spoke and did lectures that there were people around before the moon. Do you have any knowledge or artifacts or anything that might pertain to that?
Well, I mentioned that temple in Bali, the Temple of the Moon, where they had an artifact, a huge brass drum that they say is from the moon. So in terms of what I actually think, I think all these planets are places where there are conscious, intelligent beings. They're all part of this virtual reality system, which is set up to give different conscious experiences. The Sanskrit word for planet or celestial body is loka, which can mean like location. Like, if you go on the web, you can go to different websites or gaming sites where you get different experiences. So I think our universe is like that. It's just a place that's been designed to give different types of conscious experience at different levels of reality. So I think all of the celestial bodies are artificial in that sense, just like any website or web location is artificial in the sense it's been designed and created to give a certain type of experience at that location. So I think all of the celestial bodies are in that sense artificial.
Now, there's a lot of artifacts and information on Nibiru. You look at the texts that were written supposedly about, I think, 6,000 years ago on clay tablets, where planet Nibiru is the 12th planet according to Zecharia Sitchin, and it comes around every X amount of years and causes horrible catastrophes. Do you have any information or knowledge pertaining to that possibility?
Well, different researchers in alternative history get their inspiration from different sources. Zecharia Sitchin, for example, was inspired by the Sumerian text. Other researchers are inspired by the Egyptian text. Other researchers are inspired by biblical text. I'm inspired by the ancient Sanskrit text of India. Now, there may be some differences among these texts, but they have a lot in common as well. So one of them is the idea of periodic catastrophes. So I may not be all that well informed about all the details of what Zecharia Sitchin said, and I may have some slightly different ideas based on my sources of inspiration, which are maybe a little bit different from his, but I think I see some commonalities, the idea of cyclical catastrophes being one of them.
So, okay. And another...
We'd have to let the followers of Zecharia Sitchin represent his ideas.
Fair enough. Now, you have a pretty good connection with the Bhaktivedanta Institute.
Yes.
Hope I said that correctly. Could you tell us more about that and what it consists of?
Well, I'm a follower of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, and there are different spiritual teachers who have come out of India, and I'm a follower of one of them. My guru was Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and he was very interested in how the teachings of ancient India related to the findings of modern science. So when he was present on the world in the 1970s, he helped organize an institute dedicated to the study of those questions, how the ancient wisdom tradition of India related to the findings of modern science. So over the years, I've been associated with that institute and also worked on my own independently as well.
So with the short time we have left here, Michael, what could you tell our audience here that would really make them reevaluate what they've been told and how they've been taught as far as civilization being maybe just a couple few thousand years old?
Well, one thing I would ask them to do is have a look at some of my books, like Forbidden Archeology. Of course, that's 900 pages long, so that may be too much for some people. As you said, some people in the reviews were saying too much information. If you think that's too much information, I brought out a shorter edition of the book called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is 300 pages long. And all these are available both in hardcover and as ebook form. And then I publish a monthly column in Atlantis Rising magazine called The Forbidden Archeologist, and I've collected 50 of those columns in a book called The Forbidden Archeologist, which they may want to have a look at. And as far as the consciousness-based things that we've been talking about, I would recommend looking at my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theories. And in June 2015, I'm going to be talking about my work along with other speakers and mystics and teachers on a spiritual cruise up to Alaska on one of the Royal Caribbean ships. And for information about that, listeners, if they want to take advantage of that opportunity to go on a cruise to Alaska and hear about a lot of these topics, they can see my website, mcremo.com, where there's a notice about that, or they can go to spiritualcruise.com, and they'll also get information about that. So I think there are a lot of ways in which people can follow up on the kinds of things that we've been talking about if they're interested. And I think everyone has to ask a question. Who do they really think they are? Do they really believe that they're just a machine made of matter in competition with other machines made of matter for survival. If they're happy with that concept of life, then, well, maybe I don't have very much to say to them. But if they have any inkling at all that there's something more to their essence than just being a robot vehicle producing and consuming more and more material things for the powers that be in this world, then yeah, they may be inspired to follow up on some of the kinds of things we've been talking about by looking more deeply into the books that I've just mentioned.
Well, hey, I'll tell you what, vacations are great, and if you can have the opportunity to take a cruise to Alaska via Royal Caribbean and have a spiritual cruise out of the deal, get some great information on philosophy, spirituality, ancient knowledge, stuff you're probably not going to get anywhere else. How amazing would that be? I certainly hope you'll come back on again with us sometime.
Yeah, just check with Lori, my publicist, and she'll set it up.
Fantastic.
A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leakproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Do you have information that the world needs to see and hear? Send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night. Inside the Borg and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain-drained media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth.
All right. We have a very special treat for you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Guest Michael Cremo, who is on the cutting edge of science and culture issues. In the course of a few months' time, he might be found on pilgrimages to sacred sites in India, appearing on a national television show, lecturing at a mainstream science conference, or speaking to an alternative science gathering. As he crosses disciplinary and cultural boundaries, he presents to the various audiences a compelling case for negotiating a new consciousness on the nature of reality. Michael Cremo is a member of the World Archeological Congress and the European Association of Archeologists, as well as an associate member of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, specializing in history and philosophy of science. Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Great to be with you and all your listeners.
Thank you so much. I've had an opportunity to go through some of your books, and the information on there literally is mind-blowing. Talk about if we really did walk with the dinosaurs billions of years ago, and you have some very compelling evidence to point to that. It sure does shatter the paradigms of the way most people were raised and the way people are taught in society and the schools. So incredible stuff. I'm hoping we can get as much information as possible with the time we're having you here on the show. But before we get into some of the juicy topics, if you could definitely tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into alternative archaeology. What was it that gave you that aha moment and made you say, hey, this is what I'm going to get into with my life?
Well, I think the path I've taken has a lot to do with the way I grew up. My father was a military officer. He was an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force. And that meant a few things for me as I was growing up. And one thing it meant was I was moving to a lot of different places. Our family would move from place to place within the United States and to different countries around the world. So that opened my eyes to the understanding that there's more than one way to look at things. There's a lot of different perspectives that one can have. And another thing that I learned growing up among people in the diplomatic service and the intelligence services in the military is that there is such a thing as secret knowledge. There are things going on in the world that most people don't know about. There are facts that are hidden from view. So that had an influence on me as I was growing up. So I got exposed to a lot of different cultures as I was growing up. And among all the cultures that I came in contact with, one of them made a lot of sense to me, and that was the spiritual culture of ancient India, where there were a lot of different ideas that were quite different than what I learned from my teachers in high school and university. You know, for example, when I started looking into the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, I could see there were accounts of a human presence on this planet going very far back in time, many millions of years, actually all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. And that was something that, as I said, was different from what I was learning in school, in high school or in university. There, my teachers were telling me that the first human beings like us came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. And before that, they said there weren't any humans like us, only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. So this idea that humans have been around for vast periods of time was something new. Of course, it's something that's found in a lot of the different ancient wisdom traditions, not just in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. But I began to wonder about that. Is there any truth to that, or is it simply mythology? And that's what got me looking into the whole history of archaeology. And, you know, when I looked in the textbooks of archaeology, the current textbooks, I didn't find any evidence that humans like us have existed for these vast periods of time. But I decided, okay, let me look beyond the textbooks. That was something that I learned as I was growing up, that there are facts sometimes that are hidden away. So I started looking into the whole history of archaeology beyond what's in the textbooks today, going back into the old scientific reports in the scientific literature. And when I did that, I found many examples of scientists finding human bones, human footprints, human artifacts, many millions of years old. So I collected all of those reports into a book called Forbidden Archeology, which is probably the book that I'm best known for. And so that's, Rex, that's how I got into this whole topic of alternative archaeology, or as I call it, forbidden archaeology.
Fantastic. And when you say that these Sanskrit writings talk about how human origins go all the way back to the beginning, could you explain that to us a little bit? What were we in the beginning? Just light beings, or were we actually physically here at the source like we are now? Were we advanced? Were we using 100% of our mind versus the 10? What could you tell us about that?
Well, that's a great question, Rex, and that's a question a lot of people started asking me after they read my book, Forbidden Archaeology. They said to me, well, okay, you've got all this evidence that human beings have been around since the beginning, really. They didn't evolve from apes and monkeys, as we're taught now. Then where did we come from? And to answer that question that came from my readers, and I'm hearing it from you again today, to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And what I said there is, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being. And today, most scientists will say that we're just machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival. As evolution scientist Richard Dawkins put it, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So it's a very materialistic picture of what a human being is. We're just machines made of matter, robot vehicles competing with each other for survival on this planet. And it's a very materialistic conception of who we are and what we are. As far as consciousness is concerned, such people would say, well, consciousness just comes from chemicals in the brain. And when, at the time of death, the chemicals in the brain become disorganized, there's no more consciousness. I take a different approach to this whole question of who we are. I say we are originally beings of pure consciousness, and this is an idea that's found in a lot of the different ancient wisdom traditions. It's certainly there in the Vedic teachings of ancient India. The idea that matter does not produce consciousness. Consciousness has its own independent existence apart from matter. Consciousness can come into contact with matter. It can become covered by matter. And as far as the question of where did we come from, I would say we are beings of pure consciousness, and that consciousness has no beginning, it has no end, it was never created, it will never be destroyed, it's always existing. And we were originally existing on a level of pure consciousness. However, now we've come into contact with matter, and when we come into contact with matter, we are given vehicles in which to function in the world of matter. And just like as human beings, we're normally meant to live on the land. If we want to live in a different element like water, we need some vehicle that will allow us to function under the water, like a submarine or a diving suit. So when a conscious self comes into contact with the material energy, it's given a vehicle made of the material energy in which to function on this level of reality. And there are different types of vehicles. There are plant vehicles, there are animal vehicles, there are human vehicles, and the full range of them is always available because each conscious self has its own level of awareness, and a particular type of vehicle will be more suitable for it than another. Just like we see people like to ride different kinds of vehicles, different types of automobiles, motorbikes, different types of vehicles. So that human vehicle was available, and the plant vehicles and animal vehicles were also available. So according to one's level of consciousness, one is placed in a certain type of vehicle. And the vehicle itself is temporary. So when the vehicle made of matter comes to an end, just like any body made of matter comes into existence at some point, and at a certain point it undergoes the experience we call death. But the conscious self does not die. It is never created, never destroyed. It just goes into another vehicle, and it keeps going into other vehicles until it's able to raise itself up beyond the level of material consciousness. Then it can exist without having to undergo the experience of the vehicle taking birth and death, coming into being and going out of existence.
Fantastic. And, you know, some of this stuff that you have as far as artifacts, if you could maybe tell our listeners the oldest artifacts that you've found.
Well, there's actually hundreds of these cases. I'll go over a few of the ones that I've always found very interesting. You know, during the California gold mine discoveries are something that's always fascinated me. During the 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners came from all over the world to get it, and they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains near the town of Sonora in Tuolumne County in California. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners were finding human artifacts. They were finding obsidian spear points, stone mortars and pestles, all kinds of stone tools and weapons, obviously made by some type of being that had human-like intelligence. Now, these things were found in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old. These discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. He wrote a massive book about these discoveries that was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. So this is really pretty astonishing, evidence for a human presence going back over 50 million years, but we don't see this mentioned in the textbooks today, although the discoveries were originally reported by a very prominent American scientist and published in a scientific publication that came out from Harvard University. These things are not mentioned in the textbooks today because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. If you've got a dominant theory in the scientific world, then scientists, when they encounter evidence that supports that theory,